you're in my
Hey, everybody. I'm Matthew Hansen. I'm the editor of the Flatwater Free Press, and I am super excited today to introduce our panel and first tell you just a tiny bit about what we're doing here. The idea here is journalism on stage, that journalism doesn't have to end the second you put down a newspaper or stop watching a video. That conversation is important, and that you can learn things journalistically and share things journalistically while we're sitting together. So Flatwater Free Press, which is Nebraska's first statewide independent nonprofit news source, it's a mouthful, I know, is committed to doing events like these. This is maybe our fourth like this, and it's super nice to see a blend of UNL students and Flatwater Free Press subscribers in the audience today, with a bunch more people watching online. So thanks for coming. So today we're going to talk about Nebraska prisons. Prisons at a Crossroads is the title, and briefly introduce the panel. I want to say two things before I begin. One, the Nebraska Department of Corrections is a super important part of the story about the correctional system in Nebraska. We did ask outgoing director Scott Frakes to join us. He declined. I don't know if there's anybody from Nebraska Department of Corrections here, but we certainly, during the Q&A, if there's anybody who's an employee, we would love thoughts or questions or comments at that point. Senator Terrell McKinney sadly could not be here. He's among the panelists, State Senator from Omaha, who has worked a lot in this area. He is ill and he couldn't be with us today. And finally, if you want information on Flatwater Free Press, they're above the trash cans, which is a very cool place for it. There's pamphlets and information on what we do. So, okay, without further ado, today's panelists. Starting closest to me, today's moderator, Natalia Alamdari, Flatwater Free Press reporter, University of Missouri journalism grad, so feel free to boo if anybody wants to. A grizzled veteran of Delaware's largest newspaper, and for the last 13 months, one of our really, really great reporters at the Flatwater Free Press. Among her coverage areas has been this story, Nebraska's overcrowded and sometimes troubled prison system, which is why she's your moderator today. Next closest to me, Doug Kobernick, appointed to the Inspector General of Corrections, as the Inspector General of Corrections by the legislature in 2015, reappointed in 2020 to a second 5-year term. His office provides legislative oversight of the Department of Correctional Services. Next to him, Dr. Mark Foxall, who has over 20 years of experience working in corrections and law enforcement. He spent 7 years as director of the Douglas County Department of Corrections and now teaches at the UNO's School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Next to him, Jasmine Harris, the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at RISE, a Master's of Public Health and dedication to creating change in her community. Jasmine uses her passion to push for systemic changes to improve the quality of life for people and their families who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. And then last but most, Carla Walker, a military veteran who served a 15 to 20-year prison sentence at the Women's Prison in York and the Lincoln Work Release Center. She's now an advocate for incarcerated Nebraskans and veterans. She connects peers to various resources to help with successful re-entry. I am going to turn it over to Natalia, and thank you for coming.
Okay, we have a lot of material to cover today, so we'll just jump right in. So to start off, we're going to start off by talking about overcrowding. Nebraska's prisons are 150% over their design capacity as of the last quarterly report. It's a challenge that has shown up in different reports for decades, and it's really projected to keep on growing. Jasmine, I'll ask you to start, but anyone else is free to jump in. How did things get to this point? Like, what are some things that came up over the legislative session last year that kind of point to this?
So how did we get here? Started way before the legislature, this legislative session this past year. I would say this probably started in the 80s. There were reports that came out back in the 80s that said about time you get to this year, you're going to have an overcrowding issue. There was reforms that were put in place or legislated, like I think 2015, and all of it didn't happen. And so you keep pushing things down the road of how do you handle overcrowding? How do you handle the sentencing structures that are happening? And that's how you get here. This past legislative session with LB 920 and the CJI process, when we're looking at the reinvestment initiative, there are recommendations that are based on data, and they're evidence-based. They are looking at the projections, and when you don't put those recommendations into play, that's how you continue to grow your population inside of your facilities. When you have people who are boots on the ground who are saying, we need this in place, and the elected officials aren't listening to you, if you will, if they aren't really taking a hard look at what is it going to be that gets us out of the situation, then you find yourself where you are. And Doug, I know you can give way more insight into a lot of that background when it comes to, over the years, what has and what hasn't happened from that legislative standpoint.
Well, thanks. Back in the 1990s, we saw that population increasing, and so the department had, and the state had a couple options. One is to build more prison beds, and one is to make changes to how people are sentenced and how long they're going to stay in the prison system. And so what they did was they built the Tecumseh prison, which is housed about 1,000 people, and also the McCook work ethic camp. which at that time was holding about 80 people. So they added beds to the system. That helped reduce the overcrowding level. But then over time, the population kept increasing and increasing. And a few years ago, we were up to over 160% of our design capacity of our prison system, which basically means if a prison is designed to hold 100 people, it's holding 160 people in that 100 space. So we became either the first or second most overcrowded system in the country, right with Alabama. Over the last couple of years, we've added some capacity, some beds to the system, so the actual overcrowding level has gone down slightly. Later this year, they're going to add, well, they actually have, just because they can be kind of forced because of what just happened at the penitentiary with a unit going down because of a plumbing issue. There's 384 new beds in the system that are coming online, and that'll bring that overcrowding level down to about 138, 139% of the design capacity. But like Jasmine said, the projections are that the population will keep increasing, and we'll kind of get right back to where we were down the road.
Yeah, and I guess Carla, maybe talk us through, why overcrowding is something that people should care about, especially if they or people in their lives have never been affected by the prison system.
I would love to. Mark, were you going to add anything to that?
Thank you, Carla. Well, before we move on to that question, looking at design capacities of the prison, that's important. And that's looking at the back end of the system. I look at the front end of the system. Why do we have so many people going to prison in the first place? And until we deal with the macrostructural conditions in the communities that give rise to incidents involving citizens and the police, resulting in arrest, confinement, and then that subsequent move from jail to the prison, then we're never going to be able to catch up on the building side. So we continue to focus on the back end of the system. And I challenge you to think about the front end of the system. What's going on in our communities around the state where people keep going into the system at alarming numbers, and we have to build to try to catch up with that. We're focusing, you have to focus there, no doubt about it, but somebody's got to take a good hard look and come up with a good comprehensive plan to try to stem the tide of people that are going into the system. So you need to look at housing, permanent supportive housing. You need to look at education. Is education equal across the divide? No. You have to look at opportunities in the communities, okay? It's education, housing, homeless, opportunities, jobs, employment. You have to look at all of those things. Poverty, and infrastructure in the community. And until you deal with those things, you're going to continue to have the problems on the back end of the system that we're experiencing today. But we keep looking at the back end and trying to fix the prison. There's a fix there, but that's not the only fix. It's a very complicated problem.
Would you repeat that for me?
Sure. Thinking about overcrowding and also kind of taking into account all the things that Mark just listed off. Why is overcrowding something that people should care about, especially if they feel like they maybe aren't directly affected by the prisons?
So what I can share is when I was inside, I spoke to some of the lifers who had been there for many years. And the rooms that we were housed in the particular housing unit that I was assigned to, was built for 2 people. By the time I got there, there were 2 sets of bunk beds, so that's 4 bodies. And some rooms, they would only allow 1 person to stand because you're going to be bumping into somebody. Now, that was a little silly for me. There's a dance or rhythm to life, I feel, and you can say, excuse me, but prison's a whole nother world. And it's really hard to describe the politics and the attitude. But you have to consider what showers are like. If your hallway has a 3-man shower stall and you have a certain amount of time before you have to get to work, you want to go eat, or there's a program you need to get to and you have to share with some other people that aren't necessarily as rhythmic or caring, it gets a little difficult. And then if a shower breaks down or if something's not working, it just makes it more difficult. And you're in an environment that is not happy and friendly. There are moments, but you have to try to navigate that. And if you're living with people that are just a little cranky, let me put it that way, and also traumatized and wounded. And how do I get my needs met and not look weak and not be taken advantage of when you have all of these other stressors? So I really appreciate what the panel has shared on this also.
Yeah, so kind of going off of that.
Can I chime in real quick?
Go ahead, yes.
I think part of the question is why would others need to care about overcrowding who may not be impacted by it as well? And I think it lends to what Dr. Foxall was getting at. It is the community aspect. 90% of people who are incarcerated are coming home. And so what are we doing to ensure that we're alleviating the problem? Because when we have the opportunity to hire folks who have criminal backgrounds, we're shunning them. We're saying, oh, you can fill out this background check, but you're not being upfront with, yeah, I'm not going to hire you. So there's this point in time when people become deflated, if you will, when they're applying for job after job after job. About 80% of people who go back into the incarceral system, when they are rearrested, they don't have a job. So if we can get people well-paying jobs, thank you all for voting for raising the minimum wage. That's where that rubber hits the road, where we need to be helping folks. When we have the opportunity to give folks housing and we don't, what are we doing? We're rendering them to where they can't meet their basic needs. So then what do people turn to? They return to those criminogenic behaviors because they have to survive. So that's why it's important for us. As the overcrowding issue happens, 90% of people who, one, didn't get health care needs or mental health needs met while incarcerated, they're coming home. We need to make sure that we are building up a community and environment that's going to help people succeed when they get home instead of shun them and then send them back in. Because I think Nebraska right now, we're sitting at a 31% recidivism rate. And so what that means is 31% of people who get out of our state prisons will find themselves back in there within 3 years if we don't remove the barriers in our community.
And when you have an overcrowded system, people come into the system, and eventually, like Jasmine said, most of them are going to get out and come out back into the community. But when you have this overcrowded system, they need to get through their rehabilitation, take programs. They start out at a higher custody level, then they kind of drop down over time, or they should, and eventually go to a community corrections center where they're out more engaged in the community and finishing that transition. But when you have that system that's so crowded, it is very difficult to get people from this point to this point in the system and to get them what they need to help with that rehabilitation and move them forward so that they have positive outcomes, so that we can lessen that recidivism rate as well.
And I really like what my colleague said about trauma. You know what? That trauma begins before you arrive in jail or before you arrive in prison. Ergo, very difficult to treat trauma in a place of confinement. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. We have to have more things to assist people in the community before that trauma befalls them. It's because trying to treat it after the fact is very difficult in a 7x10 room over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thinking about trauma, that's one of the things that I've kind of kept in mind, like through all the stories that I've been writing about this, is that thought of like once a person does get to the point where they're in the prison system, like how many traumas and experiences have led to that. And then the department is having to figure out how to rehabilitate just years and years of those experiences. Which, Doug, you kind of mentioned some things about programming and overcrowding that kind of lead into my next question is, Carla described what she'd experienced at the women's prison. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the effects on crowding, at Tecumseh, the state pen, things like that.
Yeah, there are 9 prisons throughout the system, and when the men come into the system, they go to something called the Diagnostic and Evaluation Center, which is now part of a bigger prison. But at that facility, there's times when they've been running at over 300% of their design capacity. So you have a facility that's designed for 160 people where they come in and they get assessed, they figure out where they're going to go from there, what are their needs going down the road. And they have 500 or more people in that system or in that facility. So what we have are all these rooms that were for one person have 2 people, or rooms that were for 2 people have 4 people. And then we have basically, they look like red sleds. That they sleep on at night, a bunch of them. And so they sleep out in the common area on the floor. So you have this facility that is designed for intake for people when they're first coming in, and it's running at overcrowding rate that is just unbelievable. And that's been like that for a number of years, and that can impact people right from the very beginning. That creates trauma on them right up front. As you move through the system, some facilities are more overcrowded than others. Tecumseh, which is the newest prison, was actually designed for about 950 people, and they have a little over 1,000 in there. So that one's not, we always look at Tecumseh as this very difficult prison and everything, and they do have some problems. We've had some riots there over the last few years. But the overcrowding is really not a problem there. It's when you get to like the Omaha Correctional Center, which is a minimum and medium custody facility that's designed for about 390 people, and we have close to 800 in there. And when you have that many people on top of each other, and I'll just say one quick story. When I first started this job about 7 years ago, I went to that facility and I walked into a room and I opened it up and there's 8 guys in that room. And I was like, holy crap, I can't believe, and I'm like, you have 8 guys in here? And they're like, and they are right on top of each other and everything. And it's unbelievable how close they are. And they're with each other all the time. And I remember saying something about how I had a teenager at the time, and I know how his shoes smelled so bad. And I thought, what is it like with 8 guys in a room? And they all laughed, but they agreed. But all those things can lead to conflict among men and women, and that creates more problems down the road for everybody.
And Dr. Foxwell, I wonder if you could give us the view too of the effects that has on staff and how they're handling things, running things throughout the day.
Well, I think it's an additional stress for staff when you have facilities that are beyond their design capacity, and you have to double up your staff. You are dealing with cranky behavior, as Carla mentioned, and then staff have to intervene. So I think that's it's a significant imposition on the individuals who are incarcerated that have to live in those types of confined conditions, and it's really difficult for staff to try to maintain good order and discipline in a facility when people are just upset about living on top of each other. And I certainly understand that. And it's difficult. It's difficult to manage a facility that is over its design capacity.
Mm-hmm. Carla, we've talked about this before, I think. For a lot of people, their understanding of prison really comes from, TV, movies, things like that. What is it that you think that people don't understand about that experience of being incarcerated? Like, what is the reality that people are missing?
Oh boy, I get to tell you about my reality. So obviously, before I went to prison, I thought it was a horrible place that people went when they got busted for doing something wrong. And the reality when I got in there was one of the first lessons that I learned was that hurt people hurt other people. And what I found was the environment is traumatizing. It's just traumatizing in there. So you have all of these wounded individuals constantly being wounded and trying to find their place, just trying to survive. Let's add in some shame. Let's add in some guilt. Let's add in all of those emotions. And then for people that have been self-medicating with drugs, and now suddenly they don't have access to that, and there's all this overstimulation. I could go on for hours, but it's really difficult to navigate. Now, when I committed my crime, I was in my mid-40s. I didn't wake up one day and decide I was going to commit a crime and then suffer the consequences. I had had a mental break and still had to take responsibility for my actions. But how do I articulate what I need? Especially, we have individuals in there who have been broken down for all of their lives. That seems to be their purpose. I was fortunate. I had lived on the outs, as we call it. I had had a military career. I had suffered and celebrated with my mental health issues. So I had a little different perspective to things. But there were just so many broken, wounded people. And what do? when you're broken and wounded. You're lashing out. Gonna follow a rule? Are you kidding me? Let me tell you how I feel about this rule. You're just trying to survive. Did I answer that?
You had said how, how do you articulate what you need? Did you have any sense of what you thought you needed at the time, or looking back, do you have a better idea of what you might have needed throughout that experience?
So, for my personal experience, I was very angry. I had been shoving anger down for years. I didn't know how to let it out appropriately, and then committed a violent crime. I knew when I got out, I could not have that kind of anger. I was not going to go through that. I was not going to put somebody through that, including my family, my neighborhood, etc. I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought.
The question was, looking back, what do you think you needed to kind of help support you throughout that time?
So it made sense that I had to figure out what an appropriate way of releasing anger and other emotions was. So when I finished the female portion of D&E, diagnostic and evaluation, I was told to immediately request anger management. That makes sense. I'll learn some things, figure it out. So 2014, I began asking for anger management classes through all the appropriate channels. I was released in 2021. I never received anger management. And that was difficult for me. I mean, I'm a military veteran who committed a violent crime. You really want to send me back out there? And I haven't had help, and I've been asking for help. But I also recognize that I had to find it as well. Classes are great. They're going to plant seeds, but what do I need? So first of all, I had to realize, I knew I had to fight, but having to fight for what I felt like the department was saying was being offered, and it was. The reason I couldn't get into anger management classes was because I wasn't fighting. I wasn't beating other people up, and I wasn't allowing other people to beat me up. Did that mean I was okay? Heck no. Oh no. No, no, no. So I started having families send me in books, and I started writing out to resources and finding whatever avenue I could. There would be books on the shelves. I'd talk to other people. We'd discuss things. It's a wonderful thing about being female, and we get to talk and try to figure things out. And one day I had this interesting conversation where one of my peers said, sometimes it feels like the Department of Corrections is an abusive partner. And another mind-blowing moment. I need help, but I can't get access to it. And when I try to get access to it, my hands kind of slapped, or I feel kind of beat up about the things. So there's just what I would say is a disconnection. If I want help, now not everybody does, let me make that clear. But if I want help and I need help and I'm trying to reach help and it's not accessible, we have a problem. The changes that I made, it was because of my determination, but I knew that because of age and because of other things. Not everybody has that kind of background, and they're waiting. They're waiting for these seeds to be planted, seeds of hope, seeds of healing. And when I would talk to my peers, they really do want that. But how do you get it? How do you get that in when you don't have enough staff and there's not enough space?
Doug, it looks like you might have some thoughts on this.
No, this earlier today, I spoke to a young lady at the women's prison in York, and they have a setting there where they're in an individual cell and they're by themselves for most of the day. And she was talking about, she's only 22, and she was talking about how she keeps getting in trouble, and she doesn't. I said, well, how do you deal with that? Have they come up with a plan for you? Have they worked with you to try to give you the programming you need, the things that you desire that you think you need to get better? And she said, no, nobody's really sat down with me. And she said she lashes out when people are disrespectful to her staff or other incarcerated females. She lashes out at them and will hit them. And so you know, there's a lot of people like that. They just don't know what to do. I mean, I remember when we first met Carla too. I mean, you were trying to figure things out and everything, and it's very difficult in those situations.
Which we've kind of walked into one of the next things I was going to ask about. So one of the stories that Flatwater reported earlier this year was looking at programming, specifically, you know, violence reduction, anger management. One of the specifics we focused in on was there was a murder case out of Norfolk 2 years ago, I believe, if I'm getting the numbers right. And the man who had committed the murder had been flagged as being high risk for domestic violence, was told he needed certain violence reduction programs, but then was told, don't take these until you're out on post-release supervision. So he went through his entire prison sentence without ever taking a single program. Doug, I wonder if you could walk us through like how it's handled, you know, deciding who should be in a program when, who to wait list, how that plays out.
Yeah, when you first come into the system, they do that assessment and they figure out, okay, what kind of risk factors do you have? What are the needs that you have going forward, and what kind of programs you need? So do you have a substance abuse need? Do you have a sex offender need? Do you have a violence program need? Things like that. So they go through that, and at some point in time, then the goal is to have you in one of those programs if they've identified that and recommended you for that. So that can be very difficult for people as they move through the system, though, because they're not always, you might have that program that you need in this facility, but you're in this facility, so it's kind of hard to get over there to get that one, especially if you have an issue with people that are in that prison and you can't go there for safety reasons. So the goal is to get people into those programs, you know, at least a couple years before that their release date, so they have time to take that program and then move into the community correction center and then move in back into their homes. What we found over the last few years is that the department's having a real tough time with a few things. One is that they don't have enough mental health staff. They've increased the staffing levels on the security side the last year, but when we look at psychologists and therapists, they have more vacancies now than they ever have. For instance, there's supposed to be 18 psychologists in the Department of Corrections, and the last time we checked, they had 6. So you have 6 people that are dedicated, they're working really hard, but how can they serve 5,000? You know, we have 5,500 people in the system, so it's very difficult for them to get out and provide those programs. Well, over half of the mental health therapist positions are empty. So those are the people that are supposed to be providing that treatment in that program. And in addition to the program, it's the daily mental health treatment too that suffers greatly, because there just aren't enough of those folks providing that. So that creates a lot of problems. And then the second thing that we found too is that we really don't know if those programs that are being provided in the department are actually effective or not, which is kind of important when everybody's needs to take those before they get paroled and get out. So the department in 2015 was actually told in law that they needed to do evaluations of their programs. And they pretty much have never done that except for one small report. So this last year, the legislature actually put a little more teeth in that language and said, you have to do it, but we're going to make you contract with somebody on the outside. We are not going to rely on you to do those evaluations. You're going to contract with somebody else who has some expertise and can look into that. So UNO actually is going to be doing that, the Center for Justice Research. And we think that will really help us understand, like, are these programs actually effective? Do they have what they need to be effective? Do they have the staffing? Do they have the therapeutic environment? All those things. So that's going to be going forward, and I think that's going to help our system long term. Not going to do much right now, but long term that should be a real benefit for our state, really.
You know, I'm a jail guy, not a prison guy, okay? But something that Doug said made me think of an example in our jail environment. And it's a 1,453-bed jail at Douglas County in Omaha, Nebraska. We've got 29 different housing units there. And Doug said, you know, the program's over here, but the person may be confined over here. And we had a very similar problem. And I also thinking about this when Carla was talking about her status as a veteran and the needs that she sought while she was incarcerated. But we come across a similar problem. We would sit in morning briefing, and we had volunteers that could help our veterans who were in our population, but they were spread out all over the jail. And said, you know what, we're going to take one housing unit, and we're going to create this veterans housing unit. And we're going to have a screening process, And the only people that we put in this housing unit will be military veterans. So we started the Veterans Housing Unit, okay? And then we had a whole host of volunteers and providers coming in that could help our veterans and meet their unique needs or make determinations to whether or not what was their discharge status or what benefits they were entitled to. So rather than having my volunteers or the providers chase the veterans all over the housing unit, we had them all in one. And out of that, they built a therapeutic community. Even the officers, we're a direct supervision facility. That means there's an officer on the unit. And that officer on the unit was a veteran. So it turned out to be a therapeutic community. And the camaraderie that developed as a result was just incredible. And the change of those folks and the bond that they developed inside that unit was absolutely incredible. So you have problems. You have to seek innovative solution. And when we put this veterans unit together, we sought the ideas of the people who were on the ground. We talked to the people who were incarcerated. We talked to the officers who were working those units. We put this plan together, and boom, we had some success. So running jails and prisons is really complex. But you just have to think, okay, A doesn't work, then we got to try B. B doesn't work, we got to try C. And you've got to continue to evolve because your population is very dynamic.
Go ahead.
And I'd love to add to that. So Dr. Foxall, I'm going to guess this was a men's unit, correct?
Yes.
So as a female, not a lot of female veterans. And so I had an opportunity to create a program or a group, but there weren't any other veterans that had a long sentence like I did. So then I had to kind of think of something else. And how do you get people that aren't military trained? It was difficult, not impossible. But that's the difference between housing men and housing women, trying to have that equality and not being able to necessarily have the same amount. So on the female side, we were able to create some programming or grouping for ourselves to uplift. You know, how do we give back to the community, and how can we start in here making changes? But it gets really hard, but I really love that solution approach that you have.
I think it also goes, and it speaks volumes, Dr. Foxall, when you say we saw a need and we listened and then we decided to make a solution and implement it. It can't always be this approach where your leadership isn't going to listen to the needs and help come up with a solution for it. And I think being open-minded from that standpoint goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Foxley, you brought up how running a prison, running a jail is just a very complex thing, which is one of the next things I was going to ask about. I wonder if you could talk us through just the elements of that complexity. Like, what are all the things that you're balancing in your head when trying to make decisions?
We don't have that much time.
Spark Notes version.
I'll give it a shot. As I look at the students, I think about the students that I talk to. Jail ops, prison ops are two completely different things. Jails turn over population really fast. We can book 18, 19, 20,000 people a year in that jail. That's a lot. And I tell people that across the country. I said, you're booking how many people in Omaha, Nebraska? I said, yeah, 20,000 people a year. And that average length of stay can be a few hours to a few days to a few weeks to a few months to a few years as you're awaiting your opportunity to go to court to address your charges. So when you've got that many in and outs, you could have 1,500 people coming in a month in a jail. You can have 1,500 people going out. So people say, well, you need to do this program. And I say, absolutely. And people say, well, you're a jail and we can't do programming because there's too many people coming in and out. Well, there's, we've got a lot of pretrial people in that facility, so they're going to be there for a little bit. So you can do programming, you just got to figure out who you can do programming with. You've got a problem, find a solution. So, but when you have that type of movement in and out, and you have those frequent, the frequency with which people come back to the facility, that's a whole nother problem that prisoners don't have to experience. We can see a person leave on a Friday and come back Friday day and come back Friday night. And that's just how quick that turnaround can be. If that person bonds out, get in trouble again because they weren't in long enough to have any type of programming, to have any type of intervention take effect. So they're back out on the street. They've not dealt with their addiction, for example. They've not dealt with the situation wherein they are homeless. They've not dealt with the fact that they are in some type of mental health crisis. They go back out on the street. They get arrested for disorderly, refusing a lawful request to leave, obstruction, trespassing, something like that, and right back in. So how you provide programming with a population that's turning over so fast is a complexity that the prisons don't have to deal with. They've got, in prisons, they've got, got to be a little careful because I'm getting out of my lane. They've got a little bit more time to assess and then apply the appropriate interventions, whereas in jails, you just don't have that. And you've got a lot of movement in jails during the day, during the week, because you got a lot of people coming and going to court. So that you have to deal with that complexity as well. And then there's 3,200 jails in this country, okay? 3,300 jails, and they all run differently, okay? And the structure of some of these old facilities is such that it's not conducive to the type of 21st century programming that empirical analysis will tell you we need to deploy to the population. And same thing with prisons. Some of the prisons' infrastructure, they're just not designed for 21st century programming. And that's a problem. People say, well, should you build a new prison? I think what you need to do is design a facility that is conducive to the type of programming we can do in the 21st century, not in the 20th century or in the 20th century. I took my students to London last May, and we walked inside a prison that was built in 1842 that was still operational. Now, I'm not saying that anything in our state is that old, but when you have an older facility, it limits what you can do programmatically speaking. So we have to think in terms of that as well. But I think one other issue too I would raise, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long, but I told you, I can go. But the other complexity that you have with the jail that the prisoners don't deal with, and those people coming in off the street are intoxicated, they're high, they're in crisis, they're angry at the situation that they find themselves in, they're angry at the police, and they're volatile, unpredictable, and you have to assess what's going on with that person. That person, do you have, what type of medication are you getting? Do you have keep-on person meds? Do you have no missed medication? We have to put you in some type of alcohol withdrawal protocol? Do we have to put you in some type of opiate withdrawal protocol? You got to deal with all of these things with a person that may not be really anxious to be straightforward because of their situation. So you've got to deal with those complexities as well. And you got to get that person to some type of baseline so that you can then begin maybe to infuse a type of programming that's going to help that individual. But if you can't get to that point and that bond money comes in, that person's out the door in less than 8 or 9 hours, what have you done? Prisoners don't have to deal with that type of volatility coming in off the street. Jails do, which adds to the complexity of what jail managers, employees have to deal with.
Really quickly, I think if nothing else, the pandemic introduced us to Zoom, and there are TVs inside, and that's a wonderful avenue for programming. I'm just throwing that seed out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let's change gears and talk a little bit about staffing. So earlier this year, the staffing situation with the department was a little more volatile. One of the stories we reported on was overtime expenses in the department. There was one person in particular who earned nearly double his salary only in overtime. From July 2020 to June 2021, he was averaging 97 hours a week, which is pretty crazy. But since then, the department negotiated raises, sign-on bonuses for new hires. Doug, I wonder if you could talk us through how things have kind of seemed to stabilize since then.
Sure. When we started looking at this 7 years ago, there's about 2,200 people that work for the Department of Corrections. And back then, there were about 260 or so vacancies throughout, so over 10% vacancy level. And really, when you looked at the security positions and the caseworker positions that were the ones dealing with the individuals right out in the prisons, that it was much higher than that. But at that point in time, we thought that was a staffing crisis. Over time, we kept seeing that increase and increase and increase. And a couple years ago, it got to about almost 400 people as far as vacancies. And I thought, wow, that's unbelievable. I was saying staffing crisis before, but what is this? Well, with COVID and everything going on, that ended up going to well over 500. So when you have a couple thousand people working and over 500 positions are vacant, you're at a 25% vacancy rate. That really impacted the Department of Corrections and how they're able to just function on a day-to-day basis. So there were 3 facilities that housed over 3,000 men that were basically locked down more hours than they ever were. So Saturdays and Sundays, they didn't really get out much at all, if at all. Their day started at about 7 o'clock or 7:30 in the morning instead of about 6 o'clock, and then it ended about 5:30 at night. So guys, in a beautiful day, not like today, they would be, in July, they'd be looking out their window at 6 o'clock at night, seeing the sun and everything, and being locked in their cells. So that did not help the stress level in those facilities. I give a lot of credit to the staff that were there and the people who are incarcerated that they were able to control all that, but it was very difficult. Now, last year they increased the salaries from about $20 as your starting wage for the initial staff to 28, so a 40% increase. They also said if you work overtime over the next year and a half, 2 years, we will pay you double. So people are working overtime now, they get $56 an hour. So that has helped the staffing levels. But as I pointed out to the legislature just a few weeks ago, despite all the gains that they've made, we've lost things, like I said, in the mental health side. We've seen vacancies increase there. And we're still at 370 vacancies at the end of September for the whole system, despite all those things that they've done. So that's a real challenge. We're going to have to see where it goes over the next few months to see if it continues to go down or if it starts coming up. And then if it goes back up and it's not going down, we've got to figure out something else. So it's a very difficult situation. Those jobs are very difficult. I admire the people who are in them, and they work very hard, and some of them put in some crazy hours. But that's kind of where we're at right now in staffing in the Department of Corrections.
Dr. Foxall, I wonder if you could tell us about, what are some of those daily stressors of being a corrections officer, kind of the elements that go into the retention challenges?
Well, I think certainly when and we certainly in the jail environment experienced our incidents of overcrowding, where we are a direct supervision facility, which means when we're staffed accordingly, we have a correctional officer inside the housing unit with the confined population. When we have staffing problems, we may have to move to a indirect supervision, which means those officers on the outside and the confined population is on the inside. We prefer the officers to be inside the housing unit with the individuals who are there, and it just really, helps for a more smoothly run operation. But if we are down on staff, and then you go into a situation where people are being ordered for overtime, and now officers would say, well, I don't know if it gets to around 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm supposed to go home at 3 o'clock. You have that. I don't know if I'm going to go home and be able to be with my family because now here comes the ordered overtime. And that is a stress. It's a stress certainly on the confined population, but it's a stress also on the population that has to work, the correctional officers that have to work there. Doug's right. I take my hat off to how hard those individuals work and under very stressful situations, because as when you have to lock down individuals and they don't have the freedom of movement that they were used to when you're staffed up, then you get that cranky behavior that Carla was talking about, and then the staff have to sometimes intervene. It also, in a jail environment, it limits some of the programming that we were able to do. And then when that happens, it also provides some stress because a lot of the way the confined population kind of settles is they move throughout the day, or they attend their programming. They get some of the tools to help them throughout the day, or manage that period of confinement. And when that goes away and you don't have that, then get a little bit cranky, and then the staff have to intervene. So those are some of the complexities that come with overcrowding. And certainly, we have television units on the housing unit. That's all well and good. But if you're in a celled housing unit and you're behind that locked door, you can't see that television. So that complicates their lives even more. It makes it even more difficult because human nature, you want to be out. We're social beings. Okay? You don't want to be in a two-person room and try to dialogue with that individual, all day long and all night long. You want to be out and you want to socialize. And we have to treat people humanely. We have to find out how better ways to treat people humanely, and staffing up our facilities is one of them. But I'm on the board of the American Jail Association, and my colleagues all across the country are complaining of the same problem. We just don't have enough staff, and it creates problems for the staff, and it creates problems for the population that's confined. And I'll reiterate, guess what? In the jail environment, these people are rotating back out to the community where you and I live.
That kind of leads into the next chunk of questions I was hoping to ask about reentry. Jasmine, I wonder if you could tell us about, kind of how RISE fits into that, the work that you all do with folks shifting into the outside world.
Yes, most definitely. So there are, a number of reentry organizations here in Nebraska that are doing this work. You have places like Mental Health Association who are providing those mental health services that people need, especially when they're coming home. I think it's filling in those gaps sometimes that the programming can't happen from the Department of Corrections side. And that's kind of like where RISE is. We're not a clinical-based program, so it's nothing that is mandated by a plan that people have when they go into the diagnosis and evaluation. So we're one of those voluntary programs that are there to offer like that pro-social kind of programming, if you will. Our program is offered in 7 of the 10 correctional facilities, and what we focus on is entrepreneurship, character development, and career readiness. And so with our program being kind of a longer-based program, 6 to 9 months, depending on when facilities are locked down or things like that, and how we can get in to operate the program, what we're doing is building the relationships with folks who take the program. The first 3 months, they're really doing a lot of that inside work. As Carla mentioned, it's kind of like that hope piece, and people seeing for once, okay, I have worth, and I may have gone through some hard times in life, but what I'm going to do is take these tools that are telling me I am somebody, and I'm going to really start looking at that and reshaping how I see things. And what we do, we bring in that community aspect. It's also that empathy piece. And when I say, what are we doing to help alleviate the problem, a lot of times it's actually saying, yeah, I may not know somebody who's incarcerated, but now I do, being a part of this program. So that way I know that people are just people, whether they're incarcerated or not. And now we are able to see that those kind of bonds being built, right? And on that second half of the program, individuals are working on business plans, and people are like, entrepreneurship, people are incarcerated, people hustle, and they really have that thrive and that tenacity to be able to build something. And these are tools that we help individuals with. Yeah, you may not actually create this business when you come home from incarceration, but what you have developed is a skill set of being able to think of something from the ground up, analyze it, being able to communicate that plan, and really just have that self-confidence and knowing what your self-worth is. And I think that's the biggest thing for us when we work with individuals, because during this process, we're getting being able to know folks, and then our reentry specialist, our reentry team comes into play. So what we're starting to do is work with individuals before they leave. We look at what is it, their earliest date for parole eligibility, or if they are mandatory releasing. So we look at that and start working with them about a year before they leave on their reentry plan. Having those conversations that many people don't think about. So if you're incarcerated for 10, 15 years, do you really know if you have clothes waiting for you outside? Some people don't have the family and friend support. So what does that look like? When you leave the Department of Corrections, you have a $100 gate fee because some people don't make it to work release to have a job to build up that savings. So how are you going to get from the gate to wherever your point B is? And so our reentry specialists are really sitting there picking people up from the gate, whether going to their parole hearings, getting them to that next stop. And then we have a lot of the community pieces that we're building out too, where we're trying to provide those wraparound supports and connect them to those referrals and supports and services in the community, because we know that reentry for a lot of folks is crisis. If you don't have a plan, are you couch surfing? Are you going to the homeless shelter? So really trying to have those conversations up front to get people prepared and walk alongside them. Our reentry specialists, majority of them are system impacted, where they've walked their own reentry, and so they understand the difficulties of it and can pour into our individuals as they're coming home. Do we get it right 100% of the time? No, because people are people. And that's the one thing about being in reentry and being in an organization to where you serve people. Life gets messy, and we have to try and do our best and also understand that people are either trying their best or they're not. So I think that's the real thing of it. We also have youth and family program that we started, where we're working with the family members of people who are incarcerated, and they don't have to have taken our program, but it's like, how do we navigate our loved one coming home? What does that look like for us? And so there's 6-week chunks of topics that they work on, whether it's parenting, whether it's dealing with healthy boundaries and creating healthy boundaries, things like that. And then there's a therapeutic art component that goes with it. So it's almost like group therapy for folks. And we started our business academy as well. So those entrepreneurs that we got started inside, they're coming home, they're getting stable, and they're really serious about starting their business. And other people who are in the community who've been system impacted, who want to start businesses, we're offering that to them as well. It's really looking at our mission of how do we help disrupt those cycles of generational incarceration, and it's really pouring into people that way.
I tip my hat to what they're doing with regard to services for the family of someone that's coming in, because you know what? You can put all the work you can into that individual, but that individual comes back to a family unit that is having difficulty. That's individual support system. So you just can't work with the one. You need to work with that support system that individual is coming back to. Otherwise, it's all going to unravel.
This kind of reminds me of something that Carla, you and I talked about a few days ago. We've talked a lot about how, there's challenges to get into clinical programs, behavioral health assistance, but, tell us a little bit too about kind of those more overlooked things that could be addressed in programming to kind of ease a person's reentry, like more on the social interaction side of things.
Well, I'm just going to apologize for kind of being a little blunt. You go to work release and you finally have men and women together. And not everyone knows how to communicate, and not everyone knows what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And not everyone has control of urges and desires. And that can distract you from your goal of having a healthy reentry. And just to back up just a little bit, so with staffing so low and folks being locked down is equivalent to being in solitary confinement. And we all know the history of solitary confinement, how dangerous that is, and what that does to your mental health. So let's just go ahead and add a little more trauma onto the huge pile of trauma. Folks need access. You have to get a job, but you also have to have a stable mental foundation. And it's not one size fits all, and not everybody's there. Everybody in that position is ready, Who wants to talk about whether you've dropped your marbles or your basket again because you are ready to get out and to do what you need to do? And then you got to figure out these phones. And what the heck is an app? And I don't want one, but I have to have one? Are you kidding me? I don't like it. And why isn't my phone working? And I have to have it to work to communicate. And not everybody knows how to have proper phone etiquette or just life etiquette. Those are those little things that we really have to address. And how do you do that with all these obstacles we already have? We just do it. We figure it out. And I believe that it does take a community, and it does take panels like this. It takes everyone at the table having open dialogue, listening to needs, listening to obstacles, addressing those issues head on.
All right, with that, I do want to open things up to the audience. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, there's a mic up here. Feel free to come on up.
Okay, I'm actually tall enough. Is this on?
I think it's on. I can hear it.
Okay. So I had a question. Is there a rehabilitation options for those in like prison with drug charges? And then can we take people there instead of just dumping them in prison? Because I don't think prison should be a place for like drug charges.
Yeah, I mean, within the Department of Corrections, there's different substance abuse treatment programs. So they have like outpatient, intensive outpatient, residential program. So those are the ones that are inside. But I think what you're saying is something I believe. If I was going to make a major change to the state correctional system, it would be to provide more substance abuse treatment and mental health treatment and assistance before anybody ever gets to corrections. Because if we could do that, we wouldn't have as many people coming into the system. Because if you break it down by why people are in the correction system, so much of it really does come back to substance abuse.
I was listening to what you asked and listening to Dr. Foxhall when you're saying the population is transient. They're back in. They could be in and out, homelessness, substance, mental health. It's the criminalization of poverty and how we look at that. And that's where you have to start fighting with the community prevention efforts when it comes to the mental health and substance use, but then we also see that there's a provider shortage. When we are trying to connect people to resources in the community, to services, there's long waits. So that's someone working with an organization who can contact someone and say, hey, we have someone who needs assistance. So if you don't know how to navigate that, then what does that look like? Because now you're in the community having a mental health breakdown and you're using substances to try to deal with that or whatever that may look like. So it's how do we really start building up our communities on that front end, because it's also on the back end. Where are those services? We're short of mental health providers. We are not short on money this upcoming session, it seems like, so that we can start putting money into these kind of things. So that's where we really need to push for the decriminalization of these, of homelessness, of substance use, of mental health, and then put those infrastructures in place so where we can help people versus putting them in jails and prisons.
So I asked a lot of questions while I was inside. I didn't have a drug charge or an alcohol charge. But some of these programs are so outdated. And I also found out at the women's prison, it was nothing to go into this program and be told, you're a terrible mother. You're never going to be a good mother. That's not helpful. You know, in the military community, they like to break you down and then build you back up. But there wasn't any building back up. And so some letters got written, some grievances got done. But it has to be healthy. Do you want me healthier, or do you want me to just struggle through this program till I can get back out and self-medicate? So they've got to do some updating. They've got to listen to these people that need these programs and see what's working and what's not working.
You know, Carla and I talked about this before we went on camera, and he says, "So, you know, what relationship can there be between academia and corrections and the work that we do?" I know you don't like that word, but it's important that we understand what programs work, what programs don't, and that's where academics can get involved, and they can do the evaluation. You can be not data-driven, okay, data-informed, okay? There's a difference, and that's important. The academics can do the research, they can do the empirical analysis, they can give you a really good idea as to the success or lack thereof you're having with this program. And it's lack thereof, get rid of it. There's so many programs exist around the country because, well, that's what we've offered for the last 10 years, so we're just going to keep doing more of the same. Well, what are your outcomes? Well, I don't know. Well, there's grant opportunities available to bring researchers into your facility, whether it's a jail or whether it's a prison, to give you some idea as to whether or not you're having a positive impact on this person's life. And some people don't allow the academics in or the researchers in, and I think that's a mistake. And very few facilities have the resources in-house to do their own empirical analysis. That takes a lot of skill and a lot of experience over time.
Any other questions from people?
I'm back again. So we're building another prison here in Nebraska, right? Maybe. Oh, okay, it's a maybe now. But if we do get this prison built, we already have problems staffing the 2 prisons we already have. How do you think we're going to be able to do this if we do build this extra prison?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's one that the legislature raised and why they didn't fund it all the way through. Because there's not a good answer. The one answer that the department did have is if you built it near Lincoln and you closed down the state penitentiary, you could move everybody from there over to that new prison. But the problem is that we actually then really didn't gain anything as far as beds and everything. So that is a challenge. I would say this: if we were to build something new, I wouldn't have it all be maximum custody beds. I would have it be more with treatment and program, have it be more of a community, a therapeutic community, and actually have more job training, job skills training, things like that. Bring in the community colleges, and even starting next year, Pell Grants are going to be available to incarcerated individuals in the department, and all the departments across the country really need to jump on that. But we also have to have a place for people to take classes, higher education classes too. So if we were going to do something like that, that's how I would do it.
What you build, how you build it, who it's for, okay, what level of individual you're bringing into that facility will dictate what type of staffing needs you have. It costs a lot of money to build a max facility, and a lot of staff run a max facility. Different kind of staff if you're building something that's geared more towards programming, therapeutic communities, things that help individuals as they reintegrate back to the community. So I would say, remember at the beginning of my conversation this afternoon, I talked about a comprehensive plan. You can't build without a comprehensive plan. Okay? If you do that, you're behind the curve already. And that comprehensive plan has to extend beyond the 10 different facilities that are around the state. It has to involve the communities where these individuals are coming from. In the absence of that, you're just doing more of the same, and that doesn't make very much sense to me.
Hear, hear.
And I'll just throw in repeating the same behavior and expecting different results is insanity. Yeah, we could get in trouble together. I can see that already. So in my dream world, I see all this money and I see the need for staffing and I see the need for programming. Ding, ding, ding. That makes sense. But it gets awful quiet. You know, we've got that fear-based approach, which I understand, but there's a balance. There's got to be a balance. But in my 54 years, and I know the pandemic's changed a few things, I really struggle with an entity saying, well, we can't do this because we don't have staffing, which sounds to me like we can't do our jobs, but we're still going to show up and get paid. Now, I know it's not that direct, and I know that there's a lot more to be considered. But if you don't have the staffing, how do you build a new building when you need programming? You need programming, and you need good programming.
It looked like we had another question.
I'm a frequent visitor to the Nebraska State Penitentiary up until the pandemic, and I like to pick the guards' brains, because I have to wait for the prisoner to come before, so there's time to talk. And I asked a female staffer what her solution was to the staffing shortage, and she said, hire more immigrants. She said Latino people who come to the penitentiary who have a job, they work hard, they never leave. They don't have the turnover problem. So I mentioned that to Scott Frakes at a Preston Love. He had like a forum like this in North Omaha, and he said, well, the problem with that is that if they're not yet U.S. citizens, they couldn't be armed in the event of a riot. Staff have to be armed, and if they were, green card or whatever, they couldn't, pick up a weapon. So do you see any pathway to maybe recruiting amongst people who are immigrants and maybe, putting them on a fast track to get U.S. citizenship so they could participate, in the event that there was some kind of event when they had to?
I would say this, that there's been a huge influx of new people into as far as staff for corrections, and there are a lot of people from other countries that are part of that. I don't know about the whole fast tracking and what the requirements are as far as being able to carry a weapon and everything. So I don't have no idea on that. But I think this last wave with the salary increases and the recruiting, we actually have seen increases in people from outside Nebraska coming in and working there.
I have thoughts, but it's not for here or now. Here or now.
I'll take someone, no matter what your background is, who's ready to work in a difficult job. And I don't know that comes in any particular racial or ethnic demographic. Just give me someone who wants to come in, work hard, and has some passion about doing their work in a human service field.
And I would maybe add too that when my office first started looking at this, we did surveys of the staff and we blasted it out to them and had great feedback. And not very many people back in 2016, 17, mentioned money as something why they were not sticking around or why their friends didn't stick around. It was more about the culture. And when I talk about the culture, it's not about the safety and those issues. It was more about the leadership within an organization, like who their supervisor was, how they were treated, things like that. That's what we learned through those surveys. So money's helpful, but we also have to make sure that there's a good work environment, work culture, and that applies to every
Right.
business, really. So
Absolutely.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe two if we keep it quick. Yeah. I'll try to keep it quick then. Thank you all very much for sharing your time with us today. I wondered, given that you did set aside time for this out of your schedules and traveled to Lincoln to do it in front of an audience that's pretty sizable, what brought you here? And if in imagining speaking to this audience, what can we do? Obviously, we have the power of a lot of people together in one space. Is it an action you'd like us to take? Is it conversations we should be having? What is it that your hope that we go away here and do thinking new thoughts, and what else can we do?
that looks like a Jasmine answer there.
Community involvement. It is this what you're doing now. It is being open-minded and listening. It is then now what we call the each one teach one. You go to your circles and you talk about what you've learned. That's one of the things with RISE. When we get our volunteers involved, we have over, right now I think it's about 900 unique volunteers who have done something with us, and they impact the circles who they're in. You have hiring managers who have been involved. You have donors who have been involved, elected officials. So it's like when you have those conversations and intentional conversations with people, it really does make a difference. When you are saying, what can we do in my little circle, and just really wrapping your mind around that, then that does make a difference. What I do with advocacy pieces is getting people involved in the answer that I had for Keatron's question was political will. And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take the power of many to move the political will in this state to do what we need to do to ensure that barriers are removed. If that means you need to contact your senator, let them know that you care. What I said for this past legislative session, so much time was spent talking about criminal justice reform. The elected officials was probably tired of it because it was on that floor. But what they didn't hear it from was their constituents. So saying, how am I going to be able to now say 2 or 3 of my friends, we're going to go talk to our elected officials, because what they start doing is listening when they get those calls and, oh, wait a minute, we had 7 calls today about this one thing. You know, it doesn't even have to be that big of a number. So it's knowing when these things are coming up. If you're keyed in, you may not care about the legislative session, but those are the things that happen to get the needle moving.
All right, let's squeeze in one more really quick question, and then I'll turn things over.
Another quick question. I'm foreign born, and I'm always surprised as to the approach of U.S. Americans to criminal justice. And so as I hear you, Dr. Foxall, taking students to London, I'm wondering if you are also taking students, and how we all could learn a whole lot more about what the Dutch do or the Norwegians do. They have trouble filling their few prisons that they have, so what the frick are we doing here? And not learning from abroad. Sometimes the best ideas are really not from this country because we have made so many mistakes here. How about we learn from abroad?
You know, when we were in London last May, as I said, we went to the magistrate's court. Well, we went to a prison. This Pentonville was built in 1842, and I'll try to be quick. And one of the things the governor, prison administrator, they call him the governor there, one of the things he said, you chaps in America hold your people in prison for a long time. And I'm thinking, he could caught me. I'm thinking, yeah, I guess we do. And the students looked at me and thought, wow, you know, yeah, we do. That's kind of reality check for us. And then we went to the magistrate's court. It's kind of misdemeanor court in the UK in London. And it's a 3-judge panel. And they're not judges, they're lay people. Now there's a solicitor there, and the solicitor's an attorney that kind of helps with the legal aspect of it. But the 3-judge panel sits in judgment, if you will, of the individual in front of them. And the emphasis is on what services does this person need so they don't offend again. And so many of these individuals got services. People would come back and they got more services, or they would challenge probation. Well, how come you didn't provide this person with these services when they were on this first offense? And so it was really interesting. The focus was not on punitiveness. The focus was on service and helping these people get a leg up, depending on whatever it was that caused them to run afoul of law in the first place. And that difference, it's just fascinating. And so I'd love to take my students there so they can see how it's done in another part of the country. Now, I will tell you, the big difference between criminal justice in the UK and criminal justice in the United States are guns. Now, that's a different session.
Yeah, different panel. With that, I'll turn things back over to Kelly. But thank you all so much for being here, and give it up for our panel.
Each one teach one. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, writing that down.
Thank y'all for coming.